All right, welcome to Rights in the Constitution. This is number 9 in the seminar series in the Constitution. And I've been thinking about this one for a long time. It really should have been one of my first presentations because it has a very strong foundational tint to it. We're talking about some principles that are very, very important in philosophies and philosophically sound ideas that built our nation. So even though it's number 9 in the series, I think it's really a foundational one that I would recommend. Hopefully you'll have some fun at it. I also want to point out and start out by giving some credit where credit is due. I have to mention all these presentations. I really feel like I don't have hardly any original ideas in these presentations. All I'm doing is compiling from the best writings, from the best men and women, the best hearts and minds, these ideas to pull together. So I want to make sure that if there's anything good in these presentations, if you like them, I want to stand outside of them as well and look on and say, hey, I'm an admirer of these presentations too, because I really don't feel like they're necessarily mine. They're just pulling together all the great people through the ages, and especially with the help of God. There's been a lot of things that I've been confused on, how to teach things right, how to understand true principles, and I really want to make sure to give the glory to Him because He's the one who's helped me understand these things. So I want to start out there. This Rights, we talk a lot about God, we talk a lot about principles, and I think it's an appropriate time to discuss that. So one person in particular I had a lot of help from his writings is a man named Ezra Taft Benson. He wrote an incredible document called The Proper Role of Government. It's intertwined in all this presentation. I could basically quote him in every one of these slides, where I got some of my information from him. So we're going to start out with 4 questions, and I think this pretty much be the premise behind the whole presentation in rights in the Constitution. What are rights? Where do rights come from? Who possesses rights? And why do rights matter in the first place? Okay, so we're going to hit those. I want to start out with the question, though. What is the American dream? When we talk about that, what's the American dream? Why isn't it called the Canadian dream or the Chinese dream or the Russian dream? The American dream is the idea that the government's going to get out of the way and you can dream and become and do whatever or whomever you want to become. You can do what you want to do, and that's the dream part of the American dream. American dream is you can do what you want to do. Government's going to get out of your way. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people nowadays think the American dream is that the government's going to support you and provide for you so you can reach all your needs and wants through government. That's not the American dream. The American dream has what to do with government not doing things, being prohibited from doing things, not from providing and being providential. So there's a basis on there, I think, as well, kind of an interesting question to start out. So as far as this, what is a right? Let's get a definition. I spent a lot of time on this definition, way too much time on this definition. I think it's well done. I think there's some complexity and some depth to it. Maybe a little philosophical, but I guess you have to bear with it, right? Since I came up with the presentation. It's my definition. Okay, here's the first thing. A right, first of all, we need to understand what a right is. To know what a right is and is not is critical, since the purpose of government is to secure our rights. Otherwise, you might find yourself supporting ideas and programs and candidates, etc., that are in conflict with the proper role of government because we don't understand what a right is. So let's look at the first part here. An individual claim. Okay, God gives rights to individuals. He doesn't give rights to groups or to governments or communities. Okay, and we're going to get a lot into this later, a lot more into this later in the presentation. And then this word claim, what's claim mean? It means to demand or to assert. Okay, so an individual claim is the first part of a right. Second thing is to a God-given ability. All right, so where do our rights come from? Well, the Declaration says they come from God. We'll get more into that as well in the presentation. But rights aren't outcomes. Rights are opportunities. Rights aren't outputs. Rights are inputs. Okay? So it's the ability. Along with that is this next part, to act for oneself and or to be free from being acted upon by others. Okay, so that first part is an individual claim to a God-given ability to act for oneself and or to be free from being acted upon by others. Okay? Now there's some other parts to this. The next is, which can be legitimately defended by use of force. All right? A right can be legitimately defended by use of force. If you truly have a just claim to something, then by nature you have the right to defend it. Your conscience is your guide. Would it violate your conscience to use force to defend yourself against an attack upon your property? No, That'd be totally within my conscience. I feel like I have the right to do that, a God-given right to defend myself. But would it violate your conscience to use force to take property from another person in order to give it to another? Yeah, that would violate my conscience. I can't do that. I can't take from one and give to another. Okay? So, both of those cases, force is needed in order for that thing to be accomplished. But in the first case, it's force to defend. It's a negative force, it's a defensive force. In the second case, it's force to be proactive, to be offensive, to provide. You see the difference there. Your conscience helps you understand it. It's pretty simple to understand it in that way. If it can be defended by force, that's a right. If you have to initiate the force and take from one to give to another, that's not a right at all. Okay? The next part of this is can be exercised by everyone. God doesn't give rights to just some people. He gives rights to all of his children, correct? So, if he gives rights to everyone, then if someone says, well, I have this right, but no one else does, that's not a right at all. It's most likely a privilege or a benefit. This next little word here is simultaneously. Everyone should be able to exercise that right at the same time. If it's mutually exclusive, it's not a right. Can everyone have life at the same time? Yeah. Can everyone have liberty at the same time? Yeah, unless someone uses their liberty to infringe on my liberty. Can everyone own property at the same time? Yes, not the same piece of property, but everyone can have private property. These things aren't mutually exclusive. Everyone can exercise them simultaneously. Okay? And does not force others to act in order for that claim to exist. Okay, rights stand on their own. They're independent. They don't depend on any other person or force in order to exist. Why? Because their source. They come from God. Okay? Now, they are natural, unalienable, and self-evident. In order for a person to have a right to something, if it's required that a different person be forced to give something up, then that's not a right. Like we talked about before, that's a privilege or a benefit. Okay? Is welfare a right? Well, no. Because what's its source? Its source is the property of other people. It can't exist unless someone else is forced to give up their property to supply the welfare for another person. Is life a right? Yes. It comes from God. It doesn't require anyone else to give up anything for that person to live. So you can see the difference there. Okay? So there's our definition. An individual claim to a God-given ability to act for oneself and or to be free from being acted upon by others, which can be legitimately defended by use of force. It can be exercised by everyone simultaneously and does not force others to act in order for that claim to exist. Okay? Like I said, maybe a long definition, but I think it's interesting to understand what a right is fundamental. It's foundational to understand the proper role of government. Because if you don't know what rights are, then you may be convinced that, well, what the government's doing is fine. Because we misunderstand what rights are. Okay, so there's the first definition, what is a right? The second question we were talking about is, where do rights come from? We already discussed that briefly. Let's get into a little bit more here. Thomas Jefferson says this: can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis? A conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are of the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath. Where do our rights come from? Either look at the foundation of the whole nation. Liberties can't exist unless we understand where they come from. They come as a gift from God. Okay, Thomas Paine further affirms this. He says, rights are not gifts from one man to another, nor from one class of men to another. It's impossible to discover any origin of rights otherwise than in the origin of man. It consequently follows that rights appertain to man in right of his existence, and must therefore be equal to every man. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit what I wrote here in the notes. What rights are equal to every man? Well, quite simply, the rights to be free, to do as we please, whatever we want to do, as long as we don't infringe on the rights of others, right? Now, this is an important point. Rights come from what individuals have in common, okay, which makes them similar by nature, not from what makes one individual inferior to another. That's the victim mentality. The victim mentality says, if I don't have as much as someone else, then I need to have more rights granted to me by government in order to make myself equal with that person. Well, that's because the focus is on an equality of things. Okay? God didn't give an equality of things to everyone. What he gave is an equality of rights, that everyone has the opportunity to do or to become, to not have anyone infringe on their life, liberty, property in that pursuit of their happiness. Okay, that's the difference. So in short, natural rights come from who we are, not from who we are not. All right? Now, that answers where our rights come from. They come from God. Frederick Bastiat says this: each of us has a natural right from God to defend his person, his liberty, and his property. These are the three basic requirements of life, and the preservation of any one of them is completely dependent upon the preservation of the other two. So the point being, who possesses rights? That's the question. Well, he's saying each of us. It means individually we possess rights. God doesn't grant rights to a group of people or to a government or to a community. He grants rights to individuals. All right? The basic foundation there. It's interesting how he says the preservation of any one of these three rights is completely dependent on the other two. Well, let's look at them. Let's look at life, liberty, and property. So, if you have liberty and property but you don't have life, that doesn't work out too well, does it? You're not even alive to use them. But let's say you're alive, you have property, but you have no liberty to do what you want to with your life or your property. Are you really free? No. What if you have your life, your liberty, and do what you want to do, but you have no property? Are you free then? Well, Hamilton says this in Federalist 73. He says, a power over a man's support is a power over his will. So if I'm alive and I'm free to do whatever I want to do, I have freedom over my will, Hamilton says, look, if you don't have property, then guess what? The means of production that keep you alive and keep you be able to move and breathe and do as you please, if someone else controls that property, then guess what? They control you. So you see, it's interesting how he puts those together. It's very, very true. Life, liberty, and property are very much intertwined and interdependent on each other. The last question was, why do rights even matter in the first place? If we know what rights are, who gives them to us, who possesses them, why does that even matter? Well, Madison says this, we rest all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government. The reason that rights matter is because the whole entire basis of our country is based on the idea of the individual having rights, that he delegates the accompanying power and authority with those rights to government to act in his behalf. Okay? And since man formed government, man is to remain master over that government. Right? Essentially in this quote, Madison's saying is we need to decentralize. We need to push power down to the people because this whole experiment, this American experiment is based on self-government. And we need not centralize power. We need to decentralize. We need to get into the hands of the people. Jefferson said an interesting quote. He said, sometimes it's said that man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he then be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the form of kings to govern him? Let history answer this question. I think history is very clear, right? Men aren't angels. Okay, Madison talked about that in another presentation, some quotes I gave. So, extrapolating from this, does that mean that self-government means you can do whatever you want to do? Because he says, look, our whole capacity of the experiment here is on this idea of self-government. Self-government means you can do whatever you want to do? Jefferson helps us out with that a little bit. He says this, of liberty, I would say that in the whole plenitude of its extent, it is unobstructed action according to our will. Okay? We're created free. We can do whatever we want to do. We can choose to do good. We can choose to do bad. We're free, aren't we? Why did God set it up that way? Well, at least for two reasons I can think of. First of all, what's good in the absence of bad? There has to be the opposition, doesn't there? It's going to be good. Well, or this is good. Well, if there's no such thing as bad, how is that good? It just is. Okay. The second thing I think is if you're forced to do good, then that's not in compliance with what God wants to happen, right? If we were forced to do good, then that would be called force, not freedom. God gave us the freedom to choose what we'd like to do, okay? That's what Jefferson's saying here. Now, he goes on to say, but rightful liberty, he qualifies this idea of liberty, doing whatever you want. Rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will, but within limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. So what restrains our actions? The equal rights of others. We can do whatever we want to do as long as we're not infringing on other people's rights. He concludes by saying, I do not add within the limits of the law, okay? Because he says what restrains our actions, our liberty, is the rights of others, the equal rights of others. He says, I'm not going to add that the law restrains our activity, because he says, I do not add within the limits of the law, because law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the right of an individual. Notice the focus he has on the individual. He has a fairly negative view of government here, right? He says, look, the law usually is the tyrant's will. So it's not the tyrant's will that restrains us, it's the equal right of others. It's natural law that restrains us. Okay? Now, John Locke was an awesome writer, very good philosopher that in some ways was the founder's founder. He says this, and he kind of is a second witness to what Jefferson's saying. Freedom is not, as we are told, liberty for every man to do what he desires. For who could be free when every other man's humor might domineer over him? Freedom is a liberty to dispose and order as he desires his person, actions, possessions, and his whole property, within the allowance of those laws under which he is, and therein not to be subject to the arbitrary will of another, but freely follow his own. There's a difference there, isn't it? Because Jefferson says, no, it's not the law that restrains us, and Locke says, no, it is the law. Okay, so these are very similar founding fathers. John Locke wasn't a founding father, but very similar ideas, foundational ideas. And let's look at the difference, though. Because Locke is saying it is within the proper role of law to restrain our actions, not just the equal rights of others. Well, that's because he defines law to be respectful of that. Okay, let's go on to the next part of his quote. Because he says, the end of law is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. For in all the states of created beings capable of laws, where there is no law, there is no freedom. For liberty is to be free from restraint and violence from others, which cannot be where there is no law. So they're saying the same thing really in the end, aren't they? Because what Locke is saying is that we're talking about natural law that complies with the laws of nature, and nature's God. And Jefferson, I'm sure, would say, well, it's fine, yeah, if law restricts our actions, our liberty, if that law complies with natural law. His problem is, history has taught us that law usually is just the tyrant's will. Okay? So we can do what we want to as long as we're not infringing on other people's rights. Jefferson adds this to it. With all these blessings, what more is necessary to make us a happy and prosperous people? Still one more thing, fellow citizens, a wise and frugal government which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuit of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of the labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government. Okay? So a lot of them are saying the same thing. There's natural law. Just think through this. The job of government is to protect us, but not to provide things for us, not to do all those things. Okay, so kind of the intro there. What are rights? Who possesses them? Who gives them to us? Who possesses them? And why do rights matter? Okay, we've got hopefully a foundational summary. We're going to get into a lot more detail on each one of those things, but it gives us an idea here. So what I want to do now, we spend a lot more time in the Declaration in this presentation. I'm going to go through the Declaration kind of word by word in some ways in the famous paragraph. Okay, we're going to start out here. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Okay, what's the first word you think of when I say self-evident? Is obvious a word that comes to mind? It's obvious, okay? They're self-evident truths that comply with the laws of nature and of nature's God. Gravity is a self-evident truth. It's obvious. And guess what? Gravity couldn't care less how many laws are legislated against it to say gravity shall not exist. Guess what? Gravity does exist. And it won't yield or won't change because of legislative action. So there's some self-evident truths out there. That all men are created equal. And here's the question. Well, what do you mean all men are created equal? I used to have brown hair, now it's turning gray. Okay, we have different colors of hair. We're all different sizes, different weight. How are we all born equal? What does that mean? Well, we're born equal in our rights. Okay? That's how we're born equal, in our natural rights. That they are endowed by their Creator. What's the word endow mean? Endow means to give a gift. So we're endowed by our Creator. We're given a godly gift, a gift from God. Okay? Make sure we know the source is God, not government. With certain unalienable rights. Unalienable rights are those gifts from God. Positive rights are granted rights, created rights, sometimes called vested rights, that are given by man or government. But these natural unalienable rights, they're given to us by God. And of course, if man, who says, I have this positive right, I have this created right, I have this vested right, gives those rights, is the person who endows us with rights, then they can take them away. It's essential that we make sure God stays in that. Okay? That among these, meaning there are other God-given rights besides the three that are listed here, are life. God's greatest gift to mankind is life. He's in charge of the giving of life. All right? Liberty, next to the gift of life itself, the right to be free, to choose, to make choices we want to for our own version of pursuing happiness is what it's all about. To be able to choose, to act, not be restrained by others. And the pursuit of happiness. And it's interesting, we're going to spend some time on this one. The right to pursue happiness, not the right to possess happiness. Remember? Rights are the inputs, not the outputs. It's the opportunity, not the results, not the outcomes. This phrase recognizes that no man can demand happiness from any other man or from the government that man creates, but man can demand and defend his right to pursue happiness against others who would inhibit his pursuit by infringing on his rights. In other words, men are free to do, become, strive, invent, think, dream, to do whatever they want to. Okay? But they don't have the right to possess happiness at the expense of another man. Now, with life, liberty, and property, I challenge you, when it said that among these are life, liberty, and property, I challenge you to find any legitimate right that comes from God, doesn't require anyone else to give it to you or sacrifice something for you in order to have it. A legitimate right that is not directly tied to life, liberty, or property. I think the founders are very inspired, the writings of the founders are very inspired, that really things do come down to life, liberty, and property. Okay? So, moving on, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. We've kind of hit this peripherally, but let's look at this. God gave man his rights, correct? Man made government to protect those rights. Man is superior to government and the ruler over it. Okay? There's another interesting inference in this phrase because it says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The inference is, without government, we won't have a security of our rights. Is that true? Yeah. Just like John Locke said a couple slides ago, we need to have law. Where there is no law, there is no freedom. It's important that we have government, a proper amount, and only a proper amount, limited government, but it's important that we do have government in order to protect those rights. Otherwise, we live in anarchy, okay? Where might is right. Okay, lastly, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. It seems to me like we've gone through these parts in the Declaration almost every presentation. Maybe it's just in my mind a lot, but deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed is very, very important, and we're going to get into more detail later on this, but as an individual, I can only do certain things using force. So, I, as an individual, can only give to government a power that I have. I have to choose to give it to him, but I have to have the power in the first place to give it to him at all. I can't give to government a power I myself don't have, because government derives their just powers from the consent of the governed. Okay? So, a lot of times we'll talk about the Declaration. Some people say, oh, look, that's just a philosophical document. It's just an idea. It's just kind of a declaration of independence from Britain. It has nothing to do with our government. Well, let's look at that a little bit, because I think it's important. I hold that the Declaration is the foundation upon which the house of the Constitution is built. If you don't have a foundation, you don't have the house, okay? Let's look at some ideas. Samuel Adams poses this idea. Before the formation of this Constitution, this Declaration of Independence was received and ratified by all the states in the Union and has never been disannulled. Okay? So he's saying the states in the Union ratified it, just like they ratified the Constitution. So there's some legitimacy to it. Let's look at the Constitution itself. Does the Constitution talk about the Declaration? If it does, then our supreme law of the land is legitimizing our Declaration of Independence. And it does. Article 7, the very last part of the Constitution, says, done in convention by the unanimous consent of the states present, the 17th day of September in the year of our Lord 1787, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 12th. So September 17th, 1787, and they're saying in that year, in the 12th year, so 11 years back from 1787 is what date? 1776. That, according to the founders, according to the Constitution itself, our rule of law says that's when our country was born, in 1776. The bearing of the Declaration of Independence is the birth date, according to the founders, according to the Constitution of our nation. So it does have some bearing. It is important. It is tied into our Constitution, and our American form of government. There's a Supreme Court case back in 1897 that says this: the Constitution is but the body and the letter of which the Declaration of Independence is the thought and the spirit. And it's always safe to read the letter of the Constitution in the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. No duty rests more imperatively upon the courts than the enforcement of those constitutional provisions intended to secure that equality of rights which is the foundation of free government. Okay? So the Supreme Court has ruled, and I don't like to quote the Supreme Court too often, but they're right on in this case, and I like the way they put this, that the Constitution is the body and the letter of the Declaration is the spirit. And succinctly, Chief Justice Warren Burger says this: the Declaration of Independence was the promise. The Constitution was the fulfillment. Okay? So we never have to be nervous, like that Supreme Court case said, we never have to be nervous of interpreting the Constitution through the eyes and through the lens of the Declaration, because the Declaration is that foundation. It's a philosophical and spiritual foundation of our nation. And to cut it off and say, oh, we're just going to look at the laws, is to cut off why the laws are put together in the first place. It's fundamentally important. It's not just another document. It's foundational to our country. Okay? So let's talk a little bit more about what's in the Constitution. I like to throw in this Article 1, Section 4, Clause 2. It says, the Congress shall assemble at least once in every year. Okay? They're saying, look, there's not that much for you to do. It's pretty simple, but you should show up once a year. Okay? I think there's some beautiful quotes I found about simplicity. First of all, consider our Constitution. It is way, way, way smaller, less voluminous than the great majority of any bill that comes across the president's desk nowadays. And there's power and simplicity, isn't there? Thomas Sowell, a famous economist, said this: people who pride themselves on their complexity and deride others for being simplistic should realize that the truth is often not very complicated. What gets complex is evading the truth. I think that applies to the Constitution. This very simple document that outlines some very powerful concepts. Simplicity is powerful. Leonardo da Vinci said this: simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. That's coming from one of the greatest minds ever, right? Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. Then Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. says, I would not give a fig for the simplicity this side of complexity, but I would give my life for the simplicity on the other side of complexity. And in my mind, that's exactly what the founders did. They had an incredible journey to and challenge to overcome. They're going to wade through this very, very complex idea of creating a new government based on ideas and concepts from history, and from logic and reason and their godliness and their morality. 4.5 months they waded through this thing, and then what they came out with on the other end was something that was simple and powerful in its simplicity. That's the power of the Constitution. And that's why what's in the Constitution, the principles that are found therein, are so important. And it can't just be ignored and say, oh, they're just trying their best. No. They understood, and like Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said, he'd give his life for that simplicity on the other side of complexity. I feel the same way about the Constitution. This limited government idea reminds me of a quote by Thomas Jefferson. He says, that government is best which governs least, because its people discipline themselves. If we are directed from Washington when to sow and when to reap, we will soon want for bread. So it is an interesting, in the Russian USSR, right? Their constitution, it guarantees things like bread and water, and yet people wanted to the tune of tens of millions of people dying, even though it was guaranteed. You can write all the laws you want, you can write all the constitutions you want, but in America, bread and water isn't guaranteed, is it? And yet we've been the most prosperous and well taken care of nation in the world, not because of what government did, but because of what people did. All right? So that government is best which governs least, the idea of limited government. Now, the preamble to the Constitution starts out with these words, we the people of the United States. Where could it be more clear that the foundation, the source of all power and authority, is in the people. We the people are ordaining and establishing this Constitution. That's important. Now, that's the preamble to the Constitution. Almost everyone knows we have a preamble. A lot of people memorized it. A thing that I didn't know till recently is there's a preamble to the Bill of Rights. And we're talking about rights in the Constitution. Of course, we're going to discuss the Bill of Rights, correct? So there was a preamble to the Bill of Rights. Now, let me start out by saying something about the Bill of Rights. A lot of people say, oh, the Bill of Rights gives us our rights. Well, these aren't rights that the Bill of Rights gives us. They're rights that God has given us that the Bill of Rights prohibits government from infringing upon. It is important. That may sound like semantics once again, but that's really important, because if you know where the source is, then you know who's in charge of that right. God gave us the rights. The Bill of Rights is really a bill of prohibitions on government from infringing on those rights. But the preamble to the Bill of Rights says this: the conventions of a number of states, having at the time of their adopting the Constitution expressed a desire, in order to prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers, that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added. Okay, so what happened is when they're going around trying to get the Constitution ratified in these different state conventions, some of the conventions said, look, we don't feel comfortable. We want to have some other restrictive and declaratory clauses. Okay? These words in here, what's misconstruction mean? It means a misinterpretation. Abuse, right? To have bad motives, to do something wrong intentionally. A declaratory clause is something that declares what rights are. And then a restrictive is to say, look, Congress can't do this. Government can't do this. So states said, we will ratify this Constitution if you give us an opportunity to put forth some ideas for a Bill of Rights. Okay? And that's why this preamble, or why the Bill of Rights is written. That's the preamble's explaining. Now, it's not that the Bill of Rights went without controversy, okay? The Federalists are very much against a Bill of Rights, okay? And Alexander Hamilton is one of the prime Federalists, and he makes a good point. It's kind of an interesting point. You have the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists, both who are pro-freedom, but both have different perspectives and points on this. The point he made, he says, I go further and affirm that bills of rights in the sense and in the extent in which they're contended for, are not only unnecessary in the proposed Constitution, but would even be dangerous. Why would a proposed Bill of Rights be dangerous? He says, quite simply, why declare that things shall not be done which there is no power to do? So why do you need a Bill of Rights that says you can't do this and you can't do this and you can't do that? He's saying, look, we never gave him power to do that in the first place. So why try to make a list, because it's not going to be exhaustive, and people will try to say, oh, it didn't say we couldn't do that, so we can do this. And essentially that's what the 10th Amendment's saying, isn't it? 10th Amendment, the last of the Bill of Rights, says this: the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Okay, that's what it's saying. Look, if we didn't list it, it's not there. Okay, so the Anti-Federalists got the Bill of Rights, and looking back, I think that was providential. I think it's good, because look how much they destroyed our God-given rights as it is. At least we have the Bill of Rights, so the government can look at it and say, oh yeah, that's right, we can't do that. It says explicitly we can't. So I think it's nice that we have the Bill of Rights. But the 10th Amendment essentially said what the Federalists are saying, look, if we haven't given you, there is no power then. The 9th Amendment was also thrown in to help satisfy some of the Federalist ideas, which are true ideas. Okay, it says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Okay, just because we list certain rights that we protected doesn't mean there aren't other rights that are God-given and can't be disparaged by government. So you see these concepts showing up. They're there in the Constitution. They make sense. Okay, let's go to the First Amendment. First Amendment is a fairly popular one that's quoted and referred to often. And people talked about these as being our First Amendment rights. Are they our First Amendment rights? No, there are God-given rights that the First Amendment prohibits government from infringing on. Because with our First Amendment rights, right, just we're given the same ideas. Government can take them away because government gave them. That's not true. God gave them. Government can't take them away. These are to prohibit government from infringing on them. We could read through this. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble or to petition the government for a redress of grievances. It's a fairly well known. Some of those are very well known. I want to focus on one that's not brought up that often. Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people peaceably to assemble. Okay, peaceably to assemble is the idea to associate, okay, to come together. Now, if I'm free to associate, does that mean that I have to associate? Obviously not, right? This concept makes it clear why unions are against the idea of freedom. They're contrary to the idea of freedom, because in unions, you're forced, in some unions, I should say, you're forced. And in some unions, in some states, they force you to join a union in order to work in that state. That's a problem, because your freedom to associate means you can, doesn't mean you have to. That's a violation of that First Amendment prohibition on government, the God-given right to associate. If I'm free to associate, does that mean that if I want to form an association, I have to include everyone? No. I can choose who I want to include in my association, right? I don't have to be told by government who will be in my association. It's my choice, because I'm free to associate with whom I'd like to. Doing otherwise would very much infringe on that right. Speaking of associations, Alexis de Tocqueville, one of my favorite, I like the way this guy thinks. He says this: the Americans make associations to give entertainments, to found seminaries, to build inns, to construct churches, to diffuse books, to send missionaries to the antipodes. In this manner, they found hospitals, prisons, and schools. Okay? If it's proposed to inculcate some truth or to foster some feeling by the encouragement of a great example, they form a society. Wherever at the head of some new undertaking you see the government in France, or a man of rank in England, in the United States you'll be sure to find an association. Why? Because that's what free people do. If they see a problem or see something they want to get done, they go fix it. They don't say, hey, government, go fix that. You guys take care of it. They say, well, I'm free. I can make choices. I can influence others to inspire them to do good things. Let's go form an association to do this and this and this and this. That's what Alexis de Tocqueville points out as one of our success factors. The idea that we don't look to government to fix our problems. We look to ourselves and we just do it. I think it's a beautiful concept. It's kind of been lost today. We're very good at saying, well, there's an agency for that, there's an agency for that. What we should say is, there doesn't need to be an agency. We can just use the power of persuasion, the power of choice. Let's work together and get something done. All right? That's especially, in my mind, that's especially abused maybe at the local levels, where we look for and ask for and apply for grants, etc., from top-down money and authority and therefore control, and we don't get to do what we want to do in the first place? Why don't we just form together and make an association and go do it? So that leads us to an interesting question. Does government have the right to, all right, so you have government have the right to do whatever it is, fill in the blank. Because Alexis de Tocqueville is saying, let's form associations. We don't need to include the government. Well, what does the government have the right to do? Well, let's define our terms first. Okay, let's define government. This word government. Washington helps us with a very famous quote, hopefully one that's memorized. It's pretty succinct. Government's not reason, it's not eloquence. Government is force. Like fire, it's a dangerous servant and a fearful master. Okay? So according to Washington, government's not a plaything, is it? Government is force. And you got to watch out, because like fire, it's a dangerous servant and a fearful master. It's something that we do need to be aware of. What its tool. The tool of government is force. So when you look at that statement, let's define our next term, which is a right. We've already defined this. Let's look at it in a little more context, though. Government is force. Well, what is a right? Well, Frederick Bastiat helps us out. He says, if every person has the right to defend, even by force, his person, his liberty, and his property, then it follows that a group of men have the right to organize and support a common force to protect these rights constantly. Thus, the principle of collective right, its reason for existing, its lawfulness, is based on individual right. Okay? So individual right is the essence and the substance behind any idea of collective or governmental power and authority. It's all based on individual right. Let's compare and contrast that, though, to Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson says this: socialism rests at bottom upon the absolute right of the community to determine its own destiny and that of its members. He says men as communities are supreme over men as individuals. He's upside down, though, isn't he? That's not the American form of government. It's not that communities are in charge of men. It's that men are in charge of and are endowed with rights and therefore can delegate to communities or to governments certain power and authority associated with that right. It's bottom up, not top down. And Woodrow Wilson, and it was shown in all his policies as well, he's very much a top down community. Socialism is in charge of people. No, people are in charge of the government. Bastiat supports this by saying, it seems to me that the rights of the state can be nothing but the regularizing of pre-existent personal rights. For my part, I cannot conceive a collective right that does not have its foundation in an individual right or presuppose it. Hence, to know whether the state is legitimately invested with a right, we must ask whether the individual has that right in virtue of his nature and in the absence of all government. I love that last part. We must ask whether the individual has that right in virtue of his nature and in the absence of all government. Okay? So, government doesn't have rights. Individuals have rights. And individuals create government, so government can't tell individuals what to do. Individuals tell government what to do. Now, the reason this is true is because it comes from, well, it's logical and it's truth. It's a principle of freedom, but it also is embodied in the Declaration of Independence, where it says, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So going back to this original question, does government have the right to? Well, when we understand that government equals force and that government doesn't have rights, then we recognize that really that question shouldn't be asked, does government have the right to? The question, when really understood what that means, is, do I have the right as an individual to use force to? That's what that top question really means, is do I have the right as an individual to use force to do certain things? Because I have the right as an individual to use force to do that, then I can delegate to government. Okay? Now, one point I wanted to make earlier, but I forgot, is when I have a right from God and I delegate, I don't delegate to government the right to do things. I delegate to government the power and the authority associated with that right. I don't delegate the right. I retain the right. Because government's just my servant, not my master. Government's just my servant, and I retain the right. Okay, if I have the right to defend myself and I hire a local police officer to help me in that, if someone comes to attack me, I still have the right to defend myself. I didn't give up that right to the sheriff. Say, oh man, I hope he shows up. Okay, so I want to make sure that's put in there. Now, another interesting thing to understand is all I can legitimately control are my actions, which is governed by choice, by freedom. I get to choose what I want to do. And the other thing I can have control over is the actions of others when it infringes on my rights, in which case I can try to work through by choice, by talking, persuasion, etc. Or if necessary and legitimately, I can use force to defend myself against their invasion on my rights. Okay? Now, when I use this, according to Ezra Taft Benson, this is the critical question, okay? Do I have the right as an individual to use force to accomplish this end? When you use that question and see that as a filter, it becomes very, very clear that the proper role of government really, when it comes down to it, is only and primarily focused on the defense of rights. And that's a very limited role. Very limited, because they're just defending rights. Because it wouldn't be right for me to use force on someone to make them do certain things or not allow them from doing certain things that should be governed by their choice. Because they're free to have choices and consequences. That's their life. I can't control that. Nor would it be right for me to use force to take from them and give to another. That's wrong. And so the only legitimate reason for government use is to defend life, liberty, and property. So it wouldn't be right for me, then it isn't right for government, because I can't transfer to them and delegate to them power and authority that I myself don't have. I can't force other people to buy products or services they don't need or want or use. Nor can I force them to give to charity. Nor can I be the one who makes the choice of how it's redistributed, okay? So there's some basic ideas there. It's really, really critical. I really feel like you can run agencies, programs, laws through this filter. Do I have the right as an individual? If I do, then it is within the proper role of government. If I don't, it's not within the proper role of government. And what does that do? It cuts out like 80% of the things the government does. It should be pretty narrow. That's right. That's how America was founded, on the idea of limited government. Okay? Ezra Taft Benson made this point. I think it's well worth talking about. Once the principle of the protective function of government gives way to the aggressive or redistributive function, then forces are set in motion that drive a nation toward totalitarianism. Sometimes the principle of the proper role of government is most annoying and inconvenient. But if government manufactures its own authority and it exercises self-proclaimed powers, not delegated by the people, then the creature exceeds the creator and becomes master. He says that pretty clearly. I'm going to throw in a little bit of commentary here, not because, probably I shouldn't, because he says it more clearly than I would. But how does this really happen? The way this happens is because we allow it. Man allows government to do things man himself cannot do, and therefore government takes on an unnatural position of having power over people's lives, liberty, and property. The result is that people flock to that government who's in a position of power, and they flock there because they want to get the benefits that government can provide. Now, what's interesting, though, as we discussed in our economics presentation, is government can't provide anything. They can't make things. They can't create wealth. Only people create wealth. And the problem is government takes from the wealth of the people in order to do what the people themselves couldn't do. Okay? And when that unnatural power is introduced, government, it becomes the monster and the master to take from some and give to the other. That's why the proper role of government should only fall within that which people themselves can do. Because there's not an unnatural force of government operating on. It's a natural force. By nature, I can defend myself. Well, then, government can defend. But if they're going to take resources because they can't produce anything, they're going to take resources from people. They should only do for those people what they could do for themselves by nature. Okay? Now, when he talked about this proper role of government being annoying and inconvenient, it reminded me of a quote by Jefferson. He said, "I'd rather be exposed to the inconveniences attending too much liberty than to those attending too small a degree of it." It's a good quote, I think. Alexis de Tocqueville, he describes a government that is not bound to its proper protective role in this way. This is a long quote, but it's powerful, I think. He says this: "Unbound power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood. But it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. It is well content that the people should rejoice, provided they think of nothing but rejoicing." For their happiness, such a government willingly labors, but it chooses to be the sole agent and the only arbiter of that happiness. It provides for their security, foresees and supplies their necessities, facilitates their pleasures, manages their principal concerns, directs their industry, regulates the descent of property, and subdivides their inheritances. What remains but to spare them all the care of thinking and all the trouble of living? It covers the surface of society with a network of small, complicated rules, minute and uniform, through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate to rise above the crowd. The will of man is not shattered, but softened, bent, guided. Men are seldom forced by it to act, but they are constantly restrained from acting. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, extinguishes, and stupefies a people, till each nation is reduced to be nothing better than a flock of timid and industrial animals, of which the government is the shepherd. Well stated? I think it's very well stated. What he's pointing out is when government goes outside of its proper role, what does it do? It does just this. Okay, I could go through the whole quote again. It does just this. It creates a benevolent, providential government who everyone seeks to give them all that they have, and the people just become sheeple, right? As others have coined that phrase, to do whatever they're told and to look to government for all that they need. That's not the proper role of government, because then it puts government at the head, and the government becomes the master over the people. But the people created the government. There's a violation of principle when the creature becomes greater than the creator. Okay? So getting back to this idea, we're going to get back here. As an individual, I have the unquestionable God-given right to be, on the one hand, free from coercion, invasion, forcible injury or death, confiscation or destruction of property, and fraud. I have undeniable, unquestionable God-given right as an individual to be free from those things. But I also have the unquestionable God-given right to be free to do some certain things, to use force to defend these freedoms, and to pursue my own version of happiness. Okay? Now, all this is contingent upon one thing. Unless I infringe on the individual rights of another. Because if I infringe on the individual rights of another, what happens? Then government shall act on me and does need to coerce me or take away from me my property in the form of a fine or etc., right? Or limit my pursuit of happiness. My idea of happiness is this. Well, it's infringing on people's rights. Oh, okay, well, they can't do it then. There's a proper role of government to do so. Okay? The thing I like to point out in this slide is the only thing I'm really free to do, to proactively or preemptively do, is to use my rights to choose. I have the choice. And it's always better when you have opportunity to use choice instead of force, because force acts on people's rights. Choice doesn't. It respects and honors other people's rights. Now, under this republic or rule of law, the Constitution explicitly, 1, prohibits government from infringing on my God-given individual rights. But it also explicitly instructs government to act on me only if I've infringed on another individual's God-given rights. In a nutshell, it all comes down to a simple concept. If an individual's God-given rights are infringed upon, government must act on that person in order to secure the other person's rights. If an individual's God-given rights are secure, government must not act. Okay? In short, once again, God created man and gave him his rights. Man created government and gave it duties to perform that are derived from man's rights. Therefore, man must remain master over the government. If government replaces God as the giver of rights, then the government will become master over man and the creature will exceed the creator. We said that 2 or 3 times, but sometimes repetition is good. All right, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to set up a model. To me, the way my mind works, I like to see simple models or simple things I can apply. Just like that question, do I have the right as an individual to do these certain things? I can run things by that filter and understand more clearly. I put a model together that I think has the same effect, the same way to help us look at different bills or agencies or ideas or programs, okay? So set it up here. On the left-hand side, we have God-given rights, and we have government action. The first thing to understand is that's kind of a misnomer there. There's no such thing as government action. It's government force, okay? That's what government is. It's force, like we've already established with Washington. Now, as we come in here and we say, look, God-given rights, when they aren't secure, then what? Then government force must act. On the contrary, when God-given rights are secure, then what? Government must not act. And why is this? Well, it complies with natural law, with individual law, right? If you aren't acting on my rights, if you aren't infringing on my rights, I'm not going to act upon you. I'm not going to force you or control you. I can't, right? It's a violation of natural rights. But if you are acting on my natural rights, then it is all right and natural and completely justified for me to use force on you to stop you from infringing on my rights. It happens at the individual level. If it happens at the individual level, then it can happen at the government level, right? Okay? So this is the basic concept that when God-given rights aren't secure, government shall act. When God-given rights are secure, government shall not act. Now, the next slide here is interesting because some people say, well, if God-given rights are secure, it's still all right for government to act. But the problem is the equation never stays this way. When government acts, remember, they're acting out of force. And the only thing government acts on, they don't act on oxygen. They don't act on ideas or concepts. Government always acts on people's life, liberty, or property. Okay, so the balancing of this equation is if government force acts, then they will act on God-given rights. Now, the reason this model works is just like the previous model. It shows up in the Declaration of Independence. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That's essentially what this model's saying, right? We need to secure rights. That's why government must act. That's why government's formed in the first place. But if God-given rights are secure, government shall not act, because the rights are already secure. We don't need government to act. So what we're going to do now is we're going to apply this model to a bunch of different scenarios. And here's where we're going to start to get, so far we've talked a lot about ideas and concept and principles and quotes. We're going to get into the Constitution now and see where these things show up. First one I want to talk about is the Transportation Security Administration, the TSA. I'm going to read some here just to make sure I state this clearly. Are the God-given rights of passengers waiting to board an airplane being violated by other passengers waiting to board an airplane? No. Are people's God-given rights secure? Yes. Well, if God-given rights are secure, then what? Government shall not act. Now, some might argue that government is providing protection of people's lives by doing these searches to make sure no bombs are going to go on board, right? But there's a difference. Am I, as a passenger on a plane, infringing on anyone's rights by simply riding the plane? No. Therefore, the government cannot use force to act on my God-given rights. Doing so would violate my right to due process of law. Okay, the Fifth Amendment here, where it says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, because I'd be treated as guilty until I can prove myself innocent. They can pat me down and search and do all these things because I'm guilty until they can prove that I'm innocent. That's the opposite of the due process of law. That's a violation of the Fifth Amendment. It's a violation of my God-given right to that privacy, okay? That's what's stated in the Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be infringed, because my God-given right to privacy in the Fourth Amendment protects government from infringing on that right. Even if they do it in the name of protection, or even if they do it in the name of, we're trying to help this and prevent bad things from happening. Well, if you have to, it's an interesting trade-off, because what we're essentially saying is I'm willing to have you, the guarantee of you stripping me of my privacy rights in order to protect me against the possibility of another right being violated. Well, no, you have to, if something is legitimate, you don't have to strip someone of their rights in order to get that, okay? Now, some people say, well, it's reasonable. I mean, it says right here, against unreasonable searches and seizures. I think it's reasonable for people to be checked if they're going to go on a plane to make sure they don't have a bomb on them. Well, guess what? The Fourth Amendment clarifies what reasonable search and seizure is. When it says, no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, in particular describing the place to be searched and the person or things to be seized. That's what a reasonable search is, okay? A warrant. You have to go before a judge and you have to get a warrant that says, look, more probably than not, this probable cause, more probably than not, I swear as an oath on my honor before God and men that I believe this is what was happening, and these are the specific things I need to go search for and seize. In that case, the judge can decide, okay, I'm going to give you this warrant because more probably than not, I agree with you and I trust your honor that we're going to go after this thing. But to just randomly search everyone, or not randomly, to search every single person is a violation of due process, a violation of privacy, violation of these rights that we have from God. And government is famous for. They're always saying this. Oh, look, we need to do this in order for your security. It reminds me of a quote by Benjamin Franklin. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Okay? Now, if someone wants to give up their God-given right to privacy and to due process of law and says, hey, yeah, you can come search me, and well, then they can, can't they? But the other way to look at this is that same question that Ezra Taft Benson posed. Do I, as an individual, have the right to go around to everyone in line to get on that plane and search them to make sure they don't have a bomb? Do I have the right to that as an individual? No. Therefore, I can't give that right to government to do it on my behalf. The free market will take care of this, won't it? There'll be people who say, I want to pay the little extra price for the security to spend a couple hours in line getting searched before I go on this airline. And each airline will be able to make the choice. What does the market demand? If the market demands that happens, then they'll all do it. And guess what? They'll do it out of choice, not out of force. They'll hire an agency to do it. They'll have incentive to do it right. And some airlines will say, we're not going to provide that service. And some people say, I don't want that service. I don't want that violation of my rights. I want my privacy, and I want due process, and I want to be treated like an American. I'm going to patronize that airline. Okay? And so the private market will figure that out. And they'll do so by choice, not by force. What about the Department of Labor, Agriculture, Energy, OSHA, etc.? Is an employer's job offered to a laborer to work for him infringing on that laborer's God-given rights? No. Is the financial success or failure of a farmer due to bad weather or planting a crop that didn't produce well have anything to do with someone infringing on his God-given rights? No again. Does the price of gasoline infringe on a consumer's God-given rights? No. Does the fact that an employee might get hurt at a job infringe on his God-given rights? No. Are the laborers, farmers, consumers, and employees' God-given rights secure? Yes. Could bad things happen? Sure. But are their rights secure? Yes. Well, if the rights are secure, then government shall not act. Okay? Government can't use force to meddle in the affairs of the market in order to make something easier on a favored group of the economy. Okay? Article 1, Section 9, Clause 6 substantiates this. It says, no preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce to one state over those of another. Now, interesting, look at that. What it's saying there is this concept that there shouldn't be preference. Government shouldn't be picking winners and losers, right? To help by the regulation of commerce to one state over those another. The rules shouldn't favor or disfavor others. And in my experience with the different groups like Department of Labor, Department of Commerce, Department of Agriculture, OSHA, etc., that's exactly what they do. The rules of regulation end up choosing winners or losers. Usually they choose the big guys over the little guys because the rules and regulations that are chosen, the big guys can handle, but it puts the little guys out of business and they can conglomerate. They can buy those little guys up and it becomes a centralization of power. Okay? According to Article 1, Section 9, Clause 6, that shouldn't happen. Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1 says, no state shall pass any ex post facto law or law impairing the obligation of contracts. When you're talking about employees or different situations, I tend to think an employee way because I was a human resource manager for 10 years. When you think about employees and employers can contract, right? It's not government's job to set the terms of that contract. It's the government's job to enforce the terms of that contract. The employee is not forced to work for them. They don't have to work for their employer. They can use choice to get themselves out of a problem. They don't have to use force to get out of a problem. Okay? So what happens is these governmental agencies end up extending their power and using a power that I as an individual don't have. I as an individual can't go in there and subsidize and help and control and make sure nothing bad happens by use of force. I can't do that. Right? You go to work, you might get hurt. Yeah, that might happen. I can't control and make sure that doesn't happen by force. So therefore, I can't delegate to government to make sure that doesn't happen by force. That's a hard one to understand. It's hard for people to think about. I discussed that a little bit more in the Q&A section. What about welfare, Social Security, Medicare? Is a person's lack of food, absence of a retirement plan, or limited access to medical care a result of someone infringing on his God-given rights? No. Are his God-given rights secure? Yes. Then government force shall not be used. Okay? To confiscate the God-given right to property of one person in order to take it from them and give it to another. The property owner may choose to give his property to a person of less fortune. That's fine. But it cannot be forced from him because he has not violated anyone's God-given rights. It doesn't matter how much the government wants to help the unfortunate. The government is us. And if we want to do something, we will with choice, not by force. All right? Amendment 5 says this. We've talked about this before. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. If I haven't violated anyone's rights, then I shouldn't have my property taken from me forcefully. That's a violation of my rights. Amendment 14. No state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Not equal things or equal, etc., etc. Just the equal protection of the laws. Welfare, Social Security, Medicare. Those are really emotional issues for those people who are the producers who are having taxes taken from them and given. As an individual, can I take from one person and give to another? No, I can't use force as an individual. Therefore, I can't give to government that power. Now, it's an interesting side note, though. I get frustrated because I have stuff taken from me and forcibly given to other people. And the producers, the taxpayers instead of the tax receivers, they get frustrated with that. They say, that's not right. That's not fair. Because what? It strips them of their property. But we have to look at the opposite side of the coin, and this is something that has to be taught. Those people, what does it do to the people who receive those welfare checks, etc.? It teaches them that you're dependent upon government. You can't possibly survive unless government does something for you. And dependent is the opposite of independent. Dependent is not free. Dependent is not independent. It's not free. And they're robbing them of their freedom. And in the process of government doing something they should not do, they control both those who pay into the system and those who receive from the system. It's a control issue. It's a freedom issue that's robbing both of us of our freedom. And that's a principle that needs to be understood and needs to be taught. Now, when this happens, when government engages in this redistribution of wealth, it's what Frederick Bastiat defines as being legalized plunder. He says this in his book, The Law. But how is this legal plunder to be identified? Quite simply, see if government takes from some persons what belongs to them and gives it to other persons to whom it does not belong. See if government benefits one citizen at the expense of another by doing what the citizen himself cannot do without committing a crime. Okay? Which I think goes to exclamation point on the idea, just because something's legal doesn't mean it's moral, doesn't mean it's right. Just because something's legal. Because there is legalized plunder going on in America today. The taking of, government doing something that I couldn't do individually. I get thrown in jail for doing what government's doing. And yet because they made it legal, people tend to say, oh, it's right then. No, just because something's legal doesn't make it moral, doesn't make it right. Now we're going to go to an interesting one, the National Defense Authorization Act. Does a person have the God-given right to speak out against the government if he feels they are infringing on his rights? Yes, that's the very essence and purpose of the First Amendment. Okay? Let's look at that First Amendment real quick. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Pretty clear. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. So, with the National Defense Authorization Act, let's apply this. Is a person infringing on anyone's God-given rights by expressing his opinion on a political issue, or a political figure, or whatever it may be, or any other issue for that matter? No. Are his and other God-given rights secure? Yes. Then government should not act on that individual. Okay? Pretty simple. In the NDAA, there's the indefinite detention of American citizens. Section 1021 says that American citizens can be detained if the president thinks they are a domestic terrorist. They can be detained, and no one will be told where they're staying. The writ of habeas corpus can be suspended. We don't have to bring forth evidence. We don't have to tell you why you're in jail. You don't have to have your day in court. No due process, an opportunity to defend yourself. Okay. Fifth Amendment says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The National Defense Authorization Act is the exact reversal of the due process of law. If you go on to the Sixth Amendment, you pretty much read through all these, and every single one of these things that stands as a God-given right, and the Sixth Amendment prohibits government from infringing on, every single one of those is a provision in the NDAA that violates it, okay? The accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury. No, not the NDAA. And to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusations. Nope. To be confronted with witnesses against him. Not that either. To have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor. Nope. And to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. In all those cases, those 5 or 6 or 7 different things that the Sixth Amendment guarantees, the NDAA violates. Okay? A lot of people don't even want to know, and ignorance is bliss, but the NDAA is alive and well, supported by both sides of the aisle, supported by all kinds of people that should know better. What in the world? We're giving the power to the government to wipe away the Sixth Amendment, to wipe away the Fifth Amendment. Well, the Sixth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment are supposed to restrict and prohibit government, and yet the government's erasing those things. NDAA is a very dangerous act. Okay? Because people's God-given rights to speech, to dissent, are protected. And just because they say or say something doesn't mean they're necessarily need to be considered a terrorist, okay? If you're for the Constitution, you carry a Bible, you have a gun, the Department of Homeland Security says, oh, you're high on the terrorist list. That's wrong. And then for them to say, well, you could be a terrorist, we're going to throw you in jail and not tell anyone, that's a wrong thing. All right, so hopefully that model helped you. I don't know, it helps me. And you can apply it to any issue there, and any bill, any program, any agency. This brings us to an interesting slide, FDR's second Bill of Rights. I didn't know this. FDR issued a second Bill of Rights, and here's what he said those rights were. Interesting when you look at them. The right to a useful and remunerative job. The right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation. The right of every farmer to raise and sell his product at a return which will give him and his family a decent living. The right of every businessman to trade. The right of every family to a decent home. The right to adequate medical care. My favorite, the right to adequate protection from economic fears. Whew, good. Government's going to make us so I don't have to fear anymore. The right to a good education. Now, remember when FDR issued this, they're right around the time of the Great Depression. People said, oh man, a right to a home, a right to a good job, a right to recreation, a right to all these things. Are those rights? They're not rights. One great progressive tactic is to call things rights that aren't rights. And that's why you have housing and urban development and EPA and OSHA and DOT, all these things that are agencies and government arms that are trying to protect things that aren't rights in the first place. And usually they're not even trying to protect them, they're trying to provide them. And if something's a right, you should be able to use you should be able to naturally use force to defend. These aren't about defending anything. And what I would say to all these rights, FDR's rights, is people do have the second Bill of Rights. They do have it in the embodiment of their pursuit of happiness. You can use your life, liberty, and property to go get a good education, to go get a home, to go get a job, to go have recreation. Go for it. No one's going to get in your way. He's saying the opposite. The government's going to provide these things for you using the force of government. And if I can't force taking from you to help this person have recreation, or just forcefully give someone recreation. I can't do that, so government can't do it. Okay, it's important. Do an interesting thing. Compare the Second Bill of Rights of FDR to the USSR Constitution, Article 118 through 121. Compare them. They're eerily similar. So many people say FDR saved our country, and I would say, well, FDR socialized our country and made it so that people thought the government was supposed to provide. They're not supposed to provide. The government's supposed to protect. And people pull themselves out of bad situations with the help of God and with hard work, blood, sweat, and tears. That's how they do it, not government. Because then once you get out of the depression, everyone's like, oh, it must be government. Government's the one who solved it. No, government's the one who prolonged it. If government had gotten out of the way, we would have solved the issue much quicker. Okay? What do we do about our predicament? What we need to do is we need to return to true principles. Okay? We need to return government to its proper role of the protective function. This only happens as we educate ourselves and then inform others and teach them, help them understand. So we can become the society that Tocqueville described, that he saw in America. He said this: no one in the United States has dared to advance the maxim that everything is permissible for the interests of society. In the United States, we don't say, oh, you can do whatever you want as long as it's good for people. He says in America, they didn't think that way. That's how we think today, but that's not how they thought, because they understood true principles of liberty. Thus, while the law permits the Americans to do what they please, religion prevents them from conceiving and forbids them to commit what is rash or unjust. Because you understand where your rights come from, you understand a fear and worship of God, then your religion will control you. Okay? As a friend of mine recently stated, the Constitution was written to govern the government. Okay? The Constitution is written to govern the United States. And the United States government exists as a relationship manager. They're in charge of relationships with overseas nations. They're in charge of the relationships between the states. But as far as government interacting with the people, that's the role of the states and local governments. People aren't to be affected, aren't to be controlled by the federal government. Okay? And then the people are supposed to act by choice. The government is just there to protect their rights, not to control them. Alexis de Tocqueville says, look, the law permits Americans to do things. We're printed to be free to do what we want to do, and we are governed not because of the fear of the law, because of the fear of God, the fear of truth, or a desire to follow truth. Benjamin Franklin says, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. The more we become corrupt and vicious and selfish and proud, the more we have need of masters. So we can see the real turn needs to be in our hearts and our minds. We need to understand true principles of freedom and live them. The interesting saying that people say, you can't legislate morality. Now, if that means you can't make laws that are based on morality, I would say nothing could be further from the truth. Of course you can. The laws are based on rules, are based on ideas, are based on principles, the right and wrong. You can't kill someone, you can't murder. There's laws against murder. Why? Because the morality says you shall not kill. God says you shall not kill. Of course you can base laws on morality. What else do you base them on? The popular opinion of the day, you need to base them on principles, right? That's the whole point. And right and wrong is the essence of laws. Laws define what's right and wrong, so of course morality is going to be the foundation. But on the opposite side, if you say when you say you can't legislate morality, you mean that laws can't define your morality or make you moral. That's very, very true. Just because something's legal doesn't make it moral. You can't rely on a law to determine your morality. Your morality must come from a fear of God, right? A desire to follow truth and not just to comply with laws. Washington makes this point that I think supports this idea. Of all the dispositions of habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. If we want to return this country to the greatness of what it was when we were founded on the true principles and when the government was acting within its proper role, then we've got to get back to religion and morality so we govern ourselves and don't look for government to govern us. Okay? And the famous quote by Adams, our Constitution is made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So, we'll end with some suggestions here. First, a quote by Samuel Adams: "The sum of all is, if we would most truly enjoy the gift of heaven, let us become a virtuous people. Then shall we both deserve and enjoy it. While on the other hand, if we are universally vicious and debauched in our manners, though the form of our constitution carries the face of the most exalted freedom, we shall in reality be the most abject slaves." That's true, right? It matters not what's written in a constitution or written in law. What matters is if we're going to follow true principles of freedom that are written therein. If we're going to be virtuous, if we're going to govern ourselves and not say, well, it's legal, so I can do that. Or they passed a law, so I can take from you and give to you. Or they passed a law, so you owe that to me. Okay? Here's some questions. Am I trying my best to learn as much as I can about God and the proper role of government, and then do I live that way? Am I looking to government to decide for me what is right and wrong, or am I looking to God to decide what's right and wrong? How do I look at the agencies, programs, laws, and issues that we discussed? Are my actions congruent with my beliefs? Do I share with others, both publicly and privately, my feelings and viewpoints about rights and the proper role of government? Am I active in my community in standing for what is right, in standing for limited government, and in standing up for God? Could I join an organization that makes my voice better heard and my actions more effective? Okay? The question is, what am I going to do? So end with the final slide that I always end. Duties are ours, results are God's. I can't effectuate the changes that need to happen, but God can. We need to return this country back to Him and back to true principles of freedom and restrain and limit the government to its proper role so that we can flourish again, both economically, freedom, religiously, whatever it may be, because we're free again and we have choice that governs our lives instead of the force of government that governs our lives. And when we do our duty, God helps those that help themselves. He'll bring forth the miracles that we need, because we need a miracle. There's no question. And all the ends of these presentations, I always feel like, man, this is heavy stuff. There's some challenges. We're not even close to what the Constitution is calling for. Principles of freedom are establishing, but we can get there through miracles, through God's help. Thank you.